In the West, a certain phrase is undergoing a silent cleansing. Traditionally, at this time of year, from Times Square in New York to London's Chinatown, you would hear that familiar greeting, Happy Chinese New Year. But today, it has been replaced by Happy Lunar New Year. It looks like a simple change of a single word, doesn't it? A move for inclusivity meant to be polite to friends from Vietnam, South Korea, and Southeast Asia. But if you believe that, you're being far too naive. For Chinese people, this isn't just a play on words. It is a territorial war over who defines Eastern civilization. This is about whether a culture that has survived 5,000 years still has the right to its own name. Today, we are going to clear away the fog. We will search for the true, original name of this festival. Let's start with a truth that most Westerners, and even some Asians, get wrong. The term Lunar New Year is a scientific misnomer. If you actually tried to live your life by a pure lunar calendar, your society would eventually collapse. A true lunar calendar, like the Islamic one, follows the moon's cycles perfectly. A lunar year is roughly 354 days long, meaning it is 11 days shorter than the solar year. If the Spring Festival were truly lunar, it would drift through the seasons. You would be celebrating Spring Festival in a blizzard one decade, and in the scorching heat of July the next. But that doesn't happen. The Chinese New Year always stays within a specific window between late January and mid-February. Why? Because the Chinese calendar is lunisolar. It is a masterpiece of ancient engineering. Over 2,000 years ago, Chinese astronomers realized the moon is a great clock for months, but a terrible clock for farming. So they anchored the lunar months to the 24 solar terms. By inserting a leap month every few years, they kept the moon in sync with the sun. Calling it Lunar New Year ignores the solar engine that actually makes it work. Scientifically, it is the Chinese lunisolar New Year, which means unity of yin and yang. But because that is a mouthful, we use the name of the civilization that engineered it, Chinese New Year. To find its origin, we go back to 104 BC, during the Han Dynasty. While Rome was still a republic, Emperor Wu of Han issued the Taichu calendar. This was the moment the world changed. The Taichu calendar officially fixed the first day of the first month as the beginning of the year, locking in the zodiac system and rituals we see today. From the 7th to the 9th century, the Tang dynasty stood as the most advanced, open, and powerful civilization on Earth. Neighboring countries like Japan, Korea, and Vietnam sent envoys and scholars to China. They weren't just buying silk and porcelain, they were downloading China's architecture, writing systems, and most importantly, its calendar. This is how the festival spread across East Asia. It became a shared heritage, but the software was designed in China. Renaming the software today doesn't change who the original architect was. So where did lunar come from? It wasn't born out of kindness. It was born out of colonial ignorance and the arrogance of the 19th century. When Western explorers arrived in the Qing Empire, they saw a civilization they couldn't fully comprehend. To the Victorian mind, the West was solar, representing the modern rational world, while the East was categorized as lunar, mystical, irrational, and ancient. This was the era of the Opium Wars. The British government, as an official policy, began forcing drug addiction upon the Chinese people to fix a trade deficit. They saw China as a birthday cake to be sliced up. They didn't bother to understand the 24 solar terms. They simply labeled it the Lunar New Year of the Heathens. The most significant political shift happened in Hong Kong in 1968. As a British colony, the government pushed the term Lunar New Year to replace Chinese New Year. It was a psychological tool of desinicization, meant to disconnect the local population from their cultural motherland. Today's companies are unknowingly repeating a colonial strategy designed to weaken Chinese identity. To understand why this name matters so much, one must understand the scars of the century of humiliation. From 1840 to 1949, China was invaded, stripped of its dignity, and poisoned by a coordinated drug trade. In 1860, British and French troops burned the old summer palace to the ground, an act of systematic looting that turned centuries of cultural heritage into ashes. During those dark years, China was labeled the sick man of Asia. Sovereignty was disregarded as foreign powers established their own courts and ignored Chinese laws. However, the founding of the People's Republic in 1949 marked the moment the nation stood up. The current insistence on the name Chinese New Year is fundamentally a reclaiming of cultural sovereignty. It is the act of a family that has finally returned to its ancestral home and refuses to let the neighbors maintain a "for rent" sign on the front door. To avoid mentioning China by renaming the festival to Lunar is often perceived as a modern form of cultural hijacking, attempting to adopt the assets of a civilization while erasing the name of its owner. The debate over a name is ultimately about truth and historical accuracy. The Chinese New Year is a masterpiece of ancient science and a symbol of civilizational continuity. It is the heartbeat of a culture that survived the fall of dynasties, the horrors of opium, and the chaos of revolution. Using the name Chinese New Year is an act of honoring that source. It is essential to acknowledge that different nations have their own unique names for this occasion. However, in the English language, Chinese New Year remains the historical and scientific root. A comparison can be made to the English language itself. Though spoken in America, Australia, and India, it remains English. There is no movement to rename it universal language for the sake of inclusivity. Next time the red lanterns appear and the firecrackers roar, it is worth remembering the journey of this day. It is a tribute to the resilience of a people who refuse to let their name be erased. One should celebrate with everyone, but credit must be given where it is due. Because history shows that a civilization that forgets its own name has no future. Happy Chinese New Year.